So next on to camera skills. This is not a photography course, so I'm going to give you the kind of cheat sheet to getting great photos without having to learn a ton of photography. The first thing you need to know is the aperture. And the blurry background with the in-focus person is known as bokeh. And the way to get bokeh is to have a lower f number, which really confusingly is called increasing your f-stop. But to cut to the chase, f2.8 has a more blurry background than f4 or f8. And similarly, f1.2 is more blurry than 2.8. So the lower the number, which is actually the higher the aperture, but the lower the number, the more blurry the background. So when you buy a lens, it will say it's f-stop on it already, or the range that it can be capable of, but then you can also change it inside your camera as well. So it's kind of a combination of the settings. So when you're buying a camera, buying a lens, if you want a blurry background, you want it to say something like f1.8, f2.8, and then you'll know you're going to be able to achieve that bokeh effect. The next thing to consider is the ISO. This is essentially the brightness. So when you're editing a photo, if you turn the brightness way up, it kind of loses all its quality and gets really washed out. And that's what happens with ISO as well. So when you're on ISO about 400, 600, if you increase it to like 2000, your image is going to get brighter, but it's also going to lose a lot of its quality, and that's called grain. When you zoom in and it's really kind of granulated, it's not beautifully crisp anymore, that's because your ISO is up too high. But it's going to be a balance for you. Sometimes grain won't be as important as brightness. Maybe you're in a dark environment and your number one thing is just to be able to see the subject. Or sometimes you might be able to change the actual lights instead of having to turn up your ISO. So you've got the aperture, which is the blurry background, and the ISO, which is the brightness. And then the third thing to consider is shutter speed, but this isn't going to affect you so much when you're filming, because it's normally about how much light you let in when you take a photo. So if the subject is moving quickly, you want a quicker shutter speed to grab the image before it blurs and goes past. But a quicker shutter speed lets in less light, so it's going to make the image darker. So in response, you'll need to turn up the ISO to let a bit more light in. So it's kind of a balance, but on video, you're not often using shutter speed, so the main things for you are going to be ISO and aperture. A couple of other things that you can do is adjust the white balance within your camera. If maybe your environment is a bit too yellow, the light is quite yellow, you can adjust the white balance to just put in a little bit more blue to take down that yellow. Or similarly, the same with pink and green, which are the opposites on the vertical spectrum. If your image is a bit too pink, you can just put in a tiny bit more green to try and make it more of a flat, even colouring. So it just depends what kind of look you're going for. And the one other tool for brightness that I found really useful is the exposure compensation. People typically just talk about the main three, ISO, shutter speed and aperture. But I found the exposure compensation really useful for just those little adjustments at the end. So I get the ISO to about the point that I want, and then the exposure compensation is on a spectrum. So I just bump it up a couple of decimals to make it a little bit brighter or a little bit darker, and I find that a really useful tool. Of course, all of this functionality is going to depend a little bit on what camera you have and how technical it is, but you're certainly going to have those main three if you're on a big DSLR. A couple of other things you might want to consider are image stabilization. Most cameras, whether they're big or small, come with this now, and especially if you're doing the travel vlogging while you're walking around, you're going to really want that. You can also do noise reduction, like wind reduction if you're out in a very windy environment, but again, I'd recommend that only for the outdoor vlogging. If you're doing a vlogging, it's really windy, then turn on the wind reduction. But if you're indoors, it'll make the sound a little bit odd because it'll be trying to take out things that aren't there, and it makes you sound sort of echoey and hollow. But that's a really useful tool if your camera has those capabilities for when you're outside. And the only other thing to consider is autofocus or manual focus. On a big DSLR, you're going to want to put it on manual focus if you're sat in one place. So I manually focus mine today on me, and then I switch it off so that the focus doesn't change. Because otherwise, as you move around and forwards and backwards, it will just slightly adjust the focus to make sure you're in focus, and that's really distracting for the viewer as it's shuffling around, and it also quite often makes a noise that will come out on your microphone. So if you're sat still, put it on manual focus. But of course, if you're moving around or walking around doing a vlog, you'll want to have it on autofocus because you're going to be moving all the time. Most of the cameras these days with the flip up screens, you can tap on the screen and it will focus on where you're tapping, the same as on an iPhone. So that's a really useful functionality on your vlogging camera. One other thing to consider is when you're doing close-up product shots, you probably want that on autofocus. So you hold it up, it will focus on the product, you have a couple of seconds of movement, and then you take it away. It'll focus back on the background, but that doesn't matter because you're coming in with another product. So it just depends on the focusing, what kind of video you're doing. So I really hope that's given you a good beginner's hacking guide to how to get the most out of your camera. Of course, there's hours of photography courses you could take, but this is just a really great introduction to make sure that your photos are as good as they can be. And actually, if you understand the three, ISO, exposure, and shutter speed, that will make a huge difference to the quality of your photos, and that's really the foundation that underpins all photography skills.